Lucas, an experienced taxi driver, drove through the city's quiet streets just before midnight. He was already used to night runs. The next passenger was a man in a hurry who got into the taxi without saying much, focused on his cell phone. The destination was the airport, and the race was peaceful, like so many others. But after the passenger got out, Lucas glanced at the back seat in the rearview mirror and, for a brief moment, swore he saw a shadow move. He blinked, looked again, blank. With a shiver running down his back, he prepared for the next race, unaware that something much darker was about to enter his car. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here, we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now, hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. The Faceless Passenger. It was another ordinary night for Lucas, an experienced taxi driver who knew the city streets like the back of his hand. The clock on the dashboard showed almost midnight, and he had already made a few quick runs between neighborhoods. The silence of the empty streets calmed him, while the soft radio filled the space with some music. The next call came in. A man in a hurry, with a leather briefcase, got into the back seat. "Airport, please," said the passenger, barely looking up from his cell phone. The run was peaceful, without conversation, and before long the airport was in sight. Nothing out of the ordinary. Lucas received payment and prepared for another race. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, he had a strange feeling. For a second, he thought he saw something move in the back seat. He blinked, wiped his eyes, and looked again. Empty. "It's just tiredness," he murmured as he headed for the next ride, not knowing that night, he wouldn't be alone in his taxi. Lucas was still a little uncomfortable after that brief moment of tension. Something didn't feel right, but he convinced himself it was just tiredness accumulated from several nights of working non-stop. He put the taxi in motion again, focused on continuing the night with a few more runs before ending the shift. A new call has appeared on your app. An address in an old part of the city, known for its narrow, poorly lit streets. Just one more race, and that's it, he thought. He drove through the empty streets, the sound of tires on wet asphalt echoing around the silent corners. When we arrived at the location, there was no one waiting on the sidewalk. He checked the address and looked around. Nothing. Suddenly, he heard a soft knock on the rear window. A man in a black suit stood there, in the shadows, with his face turned to the ground, his hat covering his eyes. Without thinking much, Lucas unlocked the doors. The man calmly got into the back seat and, without lifting his head, said in a low, hoarse voice, "Central Street, please." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine, but he tried not to show it. He was just another passenger, right? As I drove, the silence inside the car was uncomfortable. Lucas looked in the rearview mirror, but the man kept his face down, his hands firmly on his knees. There was something strange about that passenger, but Lucas couldn't identify what. Suddenly, the man spoke, breaking the silence abruptly. "You've already taken many passengers, haven't you, Lucas?" Lucas was surprised. "Yes, of course. It's my job," he replied, trying to sound casual, although the tone of the man's voice bothered him. But the passenger continued. "And you see them all?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds, making Lucas' stomach turn. He looked in the rearview mirror again, and now realized something was wrong. The man was strangely still, his head still lowered. It was as if he were a solid shadow, an oppressive presence that filled the entire car. "What do you mean, see them all?" Lucas asked, his hand on the steering wheel becoming firmer, his heart racing. The man did not respond. The tension in the air was almost palpable, as if the very environment around them was changing. When Lucas finally parked on Central Street, he turned around to announce the end of the race, but the back seat was empty. Lucas blinked, confused and dazed. The man had simply disappeared. The back seat was empty, with no sign of anyone even getting into the car. Speechless, he turned forward, trying to understand what had just happened. The clock on the dashboard blinked for a second, and then suddenly the radio began to hiss, emitting distorted sounds. He turned off the radio, now feeling cold sweat running down the back of his neck. Something very wrong was happening. With his heart racing, he decided to drive back to the point where he had picked up the passenger, trying to find some explanation. But the further he went through the dark streets, the more the feeling of being watched grew. Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, there he was again. The man with his face tilted down, sitting in the back seat, as if he had never left. The air inside the taxi turned cold, and Lucas felt his body paralyze. With a trembling voice, he asked, Who are you?" And then, slowly, the passenger began to lift his head, revealing something that made Lucas almost lose control of the car. There was no face. Just a smooth, pale surface with no eyes, nose, or mouth. The passenger was not human. Lucas almost lost control of the car when he saw the passenger's featureless face. His heart raced, and his hands shook on the steering wheel. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air couldn't seem to enter his lungs. The figure in the back seat, now completely motionless, just watched him, or so he felt, even without eyes. Without much thought, Lucas stepped on the accelerator, the car leaping forward with a roar of tires. The passenger didn't move, but his presence was oppressive, as if he were taking up more space than he should. The taxi driver, sweating cold, tried to focus on the road, but the rear view mirror continued to draw his gaze to that being, or whatever it was. The street seemed to lengthen in front of him, the city becoming strangely empty and silent, as if the entire world had disappeared. The surrounding buildings were just blurry shadows, and streetlights flickered intermittently, adding to the feeling that something terribly wrong was happening. "You shouldn't be here," Lucas muttered, without even knowing who he was talking to. Suddenly, the faceless passenger began to move. Slowly, he tilted his head to the side, as if he were watching Lucas, even though he had no eyes. The hands, pale and thin, slid slowly across the knees, and Lucas could hear the light sound of his fingers scratching the fabric of the seat. The sound was soft but disturbing. Then, without warning, the car radio came to life, screeching distortedly, playing a song Lucas didn't recognize. The notes were dissonant, disturbing, almost as if they were composed of whispering voices. It's your time, the words seemed to echo in Lucas' mind, but he didn't know where they came from. The air inside the taxi grew heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was condensing around him. Lucas's vision began to blur, fear growing by the second. He needed to get rid of that thing. He turned the corner sharply, stopping the car abruptly. "Get out!" Lucas shouted, without even looking back. "Leave now." But the passenger didn't respond. The silence that followed was more suffocating than any noise. The tension was unbearable. Breathing heavily, Lucas finally had the courage to look in the rearview mirror once again. The seat was empty. He blinked, dazedly, looking around the car. Where did he go? It was as if the figure had simply disappeared into thin air. Lucas's breathing was heavy, and his hands, still shaking, gripped the steering wheel as if his life depended on it. He got out of the car, feeling the cool night air hit his face, but it didn't ease the dread that consumed him. That wasn't human. He was no ordinary passenger, and he knew this wasn't over. As he tried to regain control, Lucas heard a sound behind him. He turned slowly, his eyes widening when he saw, in the distance, the same faceless figure, now standing in the dim light of a streetlight. His head was slightly tilted, his arms were at his sides, watching him from afar. Lucas got into the car and accelerated. It was following him. The clock on the dashboard was flashing again, and now it was showing a strange time, as if time was distorting. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed since the passenger first got into the car. Lucas drove through the streets, which now seemed endless, as if he would never find a way out. His mind was racing as fast as the car. What was that thing? What did you want from him? He tried to call someone, but his cell phone had no signal, and the radio was screeching non-stop. He was trapped in that endless night, alone with that ghostly presence that followed him around every corner. And then, suddenly, he felt something cold touching his shoulder. Inside the car. He braked sharply, almost throwing himself out of the car, as a wave of panic consumed him. When he looked inside again, the faceless passenger was there, sitting calmly in the back seat. This time, he was not motionless. He was closer, leaning forward, as if he was trying to get closer to Lucas. The taxi was now shrouded in total darkness, and the only sound was Lucas' rapid, heavy breathing. He knew he needed to get out of there, but where would he go? There was nowhere else to run. Not knowing what to do, Lucas started driving again, the faceless passenger increasingly present in the car. He didn't move, but the psychological pressure was overwhelming. The figure seemed to consume the space around him, and Lucas felt like he was losing track of time and space. In the back of his mind, a single sentence repeated itself, becoming clearer and clearer: "He won't stop until he takes you." Lucas drove in complete panic. The taxi driver knew that running away was futile, but instinct kept him going, even though terror was consuming every part of his mind. The faceless passenger remained in the back seat, closer than ever, his oppressive presence seeming to absorb the air in the car. Lucas's breathing was uneven, and sweat ran down his face, mixing with the tears he was trying to hold back. "What do you want?" Lucas shouted, his voice desperate, his eyes constantly darting back to the rearview mirror, where the motionless, faceless figure remained. There was no response. Just that suffocating silence. The radio started to crackle again, but this time it was different. Amidst the static noise, Lucas heard a low voice, almost a whisper, but it was his own voice. The radio was repeating his question, "What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?" As if it was mocking him. The road ahead seemed to stretch out, as if he had been driving for hours without getting anywhere. It was as if he was trapped in a distorted reality where time and space no longer followed any logic. The city seemed to disappear. The streets were completely deserted, the surrounding buildings dissolving into indistinct shadows, and the streetlights flickered, getting further and further away. The faceless passenger was closer now. Lucas could feel his presence practically next to him, as if he was about to be devoured by that thing. The figure, motionless, with its head tilted, seemed to be waiting for the right moment to attack. Lucas's fear grew exponentially. Suddenly, the taxi's engine choked and the car began to lose speed, slowing down until it came to a complete stop. Lucas tried to restart the car, turning the key several times, but nothing happened. The taxi was dead. Just like your last ray of hope. No, no, no. This can't be happening, Lucas muttered, pounding the steering wheel with shaking hands. The silence inside the car became absolute, time seemed frozen. Lucas hesitantly turned slowly to look directly at the back seat, and his heart nearly stopped. The faceless passenger was next to him, leaning forward, just inches from his face. The smooth, pale surface where the face should have been was a terrifying void. It was as if it was about to consume him. Lucas, overcome by despair, opened the car door and threw himself out, falling heavily onto the cold asphalt. He stood up quickly, breathing hard, and looked around, but the car was empty. There was no sign of the figure inside or outside the vehicle. He was alone, or so he thought. As he started to walk away from the taxi, he felt a presence behind him. His body was completely paralyzed. He didn't want to look, but something was forcing him to turn away. Slowly, against his will, he turned his head. There was the faceless passenger, standing on the road, just a few meters away from him. The figure began to approach, slowly, as if it knew that Lucas couldn't escape. The faceless body seemed to move effortlessly, floating slightly above the ground. Lucas backed away, stumbling, but with every step he took back, the passenger got even closer. Desperate, Lucas found himself trapped in a deserted street, with no way out. His heart was beating so hard that he thought he would faint at any moment. And then, the passenger stopped just inches away from him. Lucas, shaking with fear, stared into the void where that entity's face should have been. And it was then that he heard the voice. It wasn't a voice coming from outside, but from inside his head. The faceless passenger's cold, empty voice whispered, "You'll never see, but I'll always be here." Lucas felt a wave of ice run down his spine. This wasn't a warning, it was a condemnation. He knew that from that moment on, he would never be alone again. The faceless passenger had marked his life. Wherever he went, whether day or night, he would be there, always lurking, waiting for the right moment to appear. The terror would never go away. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The passenger reached out his pale hand towards Lucas's face, and, before he could react, he felt the cold, empty touch of that entity. Reality distorted around him. Everything went dark. Lucas's world collapsed. The next morning, Lucas's taxi was found abandoned on a deserted street, with the door open and the engine turned off. There was no sign of a struggle, but Lucas was never seen again. The few who knew the taxi driver spoke of a tormented man who began to see things that no one else saw. But what few knew is that, on silent nights in the city, a taxi is sometimes seen driving empty through the streets, as if it were waiting for a passenger. And they say that if you get into this taxi, in the back seat, you can see the shadow of a faceless man reflected in the window glass. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.